Greetings, carbon-based life forms. Each time you breathe, you increase the CO2 concentration of the air you use by 100 times. Is your breathing polluting? The green zombies say yes. They say, we say, where is the hard evidence? Don't use bureaucratic science that ignores the scientific method. The Supreme Court said the sea levels are rising, threatening the coastlines of Massachusetts. Therefore, CO2 is a greenhouse gas that can be regulated under the Clean Air Act. We say bureaucratic science. Sea levels have been rising for 18,000 years, long before there were automobiles. And CO2 is invisible and non-toxic. The EPA claimed greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare because they are causing dangerous warming. We say bureaucratic science. You ignore the most critical evidence. There is little warming of the atmosphere where the greenhouse gases are. And you use models that have not been validated, thus are meaningless. The IPCC claims CO2 will cause 1 billion species will go extinct. Have they ever heard of photosynthesis? It's been happening for about 3.5 billion years. Blue-green bacteria use the energy of the sun to break apart molecules of water and CO2, producing sugars and oxygen. This process has resulted in multicellular life and animals. Most food for living things comes from photosynthesis. As Pat Michaels pointed out, Craig Itzo, and the NIPCC reports show, thousands of species are benefiting from increasing CO2. We have over 35 years of satellite imagery showing life flourishing with more CO2. Yet the UN says we will go extinct. The issue will continue for years to come, and CEP will continue to insist on proper use of the scientific method in establishing government policies. You have in your packet a brief description of CEP and the current recipient of our Frederick Seitz Award. In 1996, CEP Chairman Frederick Seitz wrote a controversial opinion in the Wall Street Journal accusing the UN IPCC of misrepresenting science. He said, "In my more than 60 years as a member of the American scientific community, including service as president of both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Physical Society, I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events that led to this IPCC report." That was the second report. Fred Singer established the Frederick Seitz Memorial Award to recognize those scientists who rigorously apply the scientific method and who confront poor science of those who do not, no matter how popular the current fad is. It is my great privilege to present this year's award with a small check to Richard Lindzen, a pillar of scientific integrity, who said of carbon dioxide caused warming, trivially true and numerically insignificant. Dick?
Thank you, Fred. It's an honor, and it's one I'm humbled at in accepting the Seitz Award. It's especially so given my respect for the late Frederick Seitz. A number of people here, Pat Michaels, Roy Spencer, been fighting this abuse of science for almost 30 years. But in accepting this award, I decided what I would like to do, if possible, is to note that we were not alone. It's been a matter of puzzle to me, because for the early period, there were a great many people of very notable distinction who, in fact, also seriously questioned the issue. And in terms of distinction, they were at the highest level. And yet, even at the very beginning, in 1988, Newsweek could refer to this issue as one where all scientists agree. From that point of view, 97% is a reduction. So, in any event, some of these names will be known to you, but I suspect many of them are not known to you, and I'm still pondering how it happened that there were so many people who questioned this, and yet it made no impact on the field. First name, of course, is Fred Seitz. Forgetting all his institutional honors, he is often considered the founder of condensed phase physics. Certainly those of us educated in the 60s, 50s, used his textbooks for solid-state physics. And that had a profound influence on the modern world, almost all our electronics. Of course, he was a professor at the University of Illinois. He was president of the National Academy. He was president of the American Physical Society. He was president of Rockefeller University, and he was also deeply committed to recording the history of science, and particularly physics, and founded the History of Physics program at the American Physical Society. He died in 2008. Another person involved was Bill Nierenberg, and Bill was director of America's foremost oceanographic institution, the Scripps Oceanographic Institute of the University of California, La Jolla. He was a member of the National Academy, and he chaired a massive 1983 National Research Council report on climate, which I believe has never been referred to again. He died in 2000. Then there was Jaron Amaya, again, a name I suspect you don't know, but Jerry was professor of meteorology at Scripps, but he was also the former head of NOAA's long-range forecasting, and he was also a member of the National Academy. He died in 1997. Robert Jastrow is probably known to more of you. He was the first chairman of NASA's Lunar Exploration Committee. He was founding director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Upon retirement, the bulk of the institute was moved back to NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Unfortunately, there was a rump group headed by Jim Hansen that successfully fought to remain in New York. Jastrow himself continued as professor of earth sciences at Dartmouth and died in 2008. Then there was Axel Vin Nielsen, name again I suspect no one here knows. But he was a scientist, senior scientist at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He was professor of meteorology and probably founder of the department, I suspect, at the University of Michigan. He was director of the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting. You should know that's Europe's foremost, preeminent atmospheric research center. He was Director General of the World Meteorological Organization and Professor of Meteorology at the University of Copenhagen. He died in 2010. Next on my list is Lennart Bengtsson. He's also head of research at the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting, and then director of the European Center. And he was director of the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg. Next is Henk Tennekes. He was professor of aeronautical engineering at Pennsylvania State University. He was director of research at the Royal Dutch Meteorological Institute, member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a leading expert on atmospheric turbulence and aviation. Some of you may remember his articles in the Bulletin of the AMS, some of the best expositions on chaos and penetrative convection, which is crucial to boundary layer clouds. Reed Bryson is known to a few of you. He was founder and first chairman of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Meteorology and Center for Climatic Research. He was the first director of the Institute, what is its full name, of Environmental Studies, now the Nelson Institute, at the University of Wisconsin, and he was Global Laureate of the United Nations Global Environmental Program. He died in 2008. One of the more interesting, quote, skeptics was Joanne Simpson. She was president of the American Meteorological Society, director of Project Storm Fury, while chief of the Experimental Meteorology Branch of the Environmental Satellite Services Administration's Institute for Atmospheric Sciences, his long name. She was NASA's lead weather researcher for many years. She was a member of the National Academy of Engineering. What is really interesting is she kept her skepticism private until she retired from NASA, and she died in 2010. Robert White was another interesting person questioning alarm. He was director of the United States Weather Bureau. He was administrator of the Environmental Science Services Administration. He was the first administrator of NOAA. He was president of the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, which runs NCAR, and he was president of the National Academy of Engineering. He was also the first chairman of the World Climate Conference in 1978. Died in 2015. Hubert Lamb, that's a name that has come up. He was the pioneer in historical climatology. He was the founding director of the Climate Research Unit established in 1972 in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. Some of you might remember that in connection with ClimateGate. He died in 1997. I vaguely remember we invited Hubert to come to MIT, and he said he couldn't come. He was afraid of what Wiggly would do in his absence. In any event, Paul Wagner's name came up. This is someone who was a rather remarkable person. He was chief scientist, soils, climatology, ecology. He was director and distinguished scientist at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. He was also a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And as Pat mentioned, he's just died. Singer, of course, is the person who established this award. Pays to know, I mean, you know, he was professor of physics at the University of Maryland, the University of Virginia, George Mason University. He was the founding dean of the University of Miami School of Environmental and Planetary Sciences. He established the National Weather Bureau Satellite Service Center. He was Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA and Chief Scientist for the Department of Transportation. But he's also credited by many for the first prediction of the Earth's radiation belts, the Van Allen belts. Then there's Ivar Gevar, and he is a Nobel laureate in physics, a member of the National Academy, the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, professor emeritus at Rensselaer Poly, and professor at large at the University of Oslo. And he is almost, I think, unique among Nobel laureates in regularly speaking out about his horror at this subject. Robert Adair is another one who probably very few of you know. He was chair of the Department of Physics and director of the Division of Physical Sciences at Yale University, and he was a member of the National Academy. He regularly complained about the statistics involved in determining temperature trends. He also was famous for a book on the physics of baseball. Sir Basil John Mason, Fellow of the Royal Society, usually went by the name John Mason. He was probably in his time the leading expert on cloud physics. He was the former Director General of the British Met Office, and he was Chancellor of the University of Manchester's Institute of Science and Technology. He died in 2015. Bill Gray is probably familiar to many of you. He was Emeritus Professor of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State, head of the Tropical Meteorology Project at CSU's Department of Atmospheric Sciences. And I think he was generally regarded as a pioneer in the science of tropical cyclone forecasting and one of the world's leading experts on tropical storms. He died in 2016. Mikhail Budiko is another name. He was a Russian climatologist, and it should be recalled that in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and subsequently in Russia, the largest institution devoted to studies of climate was the main geophysical observatory in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. I never understood, but it had allegedly some 5,000 scientists. At any rate, it was headed at one time by Budiko. He was a Russian climatologist, certainly one of the founders of physical climatology. He was director of the Division of Climate Change Research at the Hydrological Institute of St. Petersburg. He died in 2001. Also there was Yuri Israel, a vice chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change until about September 2008. He was director of the Institute of Global Climate and Ecology, which was part of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He was the first vice president of the World Meteorological Organization and helped develop the World Weather Watch. He died in 2014. Another Russian was Kirill Kondratyev. He was professor of atmospheric physics, chief of the Department of Atmospheric Physics, vice rector, and rector of the University of Leningrad. From 1958 to 61, he was head of the Department of Radiation Studies at the Main Geophysical Observatory, served as a member of the International Program Committee for the World Conference on Climate Change held in Moscow in 2003. He died in 2006. He was certainly Russia's leading expert on radiative transfer. Will Happer, of course, has been mentioned many times. He's been involved in this field. I was surprised to look at my emails. I mean, it's almost 20 years that I have been in contact with him on this issue. He's an experimental physicist, for those who don't know, who spent most of his career at Princeton and Columbia. He's the inventor of the sodium guide star that's used in most big modern telescopes to compensate for atmospheric turbulence with adaptive optics. He was a pioneer in medical magnetic resonance imaging with laser polarized noble gases. He served as the director of energy research at the U.S. Department of Energy from 1990 to 93, member of the National Academy, and currently, for at least a while longer, the Deputy Assistant to the President, Senior Director for Emerging Technologies in the National Security Council. I should mention that one of the things that got Will involved in this issue as a very senior scientist was the period when he was in charge of research at the Department of Energy. And he made the curious observation. The Department of Energy funds the bulk of high-energy physics in America. And so his dealings were primarily with physicists, experimental and theoretical. And he noticed whenever he had to deal with them and ask questions, they were delighted to discuss their work. When he asked any of the people in the climate program, they took offense at being asked questions, and this led him to some question. The last person I'll mention is one, again, which many of you wouldn't know, but some of you, I think, are from France, and it's Claude Claude. And Claude Claude's basic interest is volcanoes, and he is the winner of a Crawford Prize, which is essentially the Nobel for the earth sciences. He was founding director of the Institute for Physics of the Earth at the University of Paris. He was also Minister of Education in France under the government of Jospin. He was a Bowie medalist of the American Geophysical Union, a member of the French Academy of Sciences, and the U.S. National Academy. Now, the curious thing about it is, one reason you haven't heard about these people is very often they were quite private in their questioning. It's also the case that somehow, it seems to me, that the rest of us didn't make an effort at contact with these people, while the image of all scientists agreeing was spread. There was very little effort, there was very little coordination. I mean, places like Heartland were very helpful in trying to introduce a measure of coordination, but clearly for many, many years, the promotion of climate alarm was highly organized, planned, thought out, funded, and the opposition was completely fragmented. The people I mentioned obviously were not fringe scientists. They were leading figures and leaders in science, and in many cases, their deep interest in climate long predated global warming hysteria and the subsequent explosion of support for endorsing alarm. But more important than this, I think, is they all, regardless of their interest in climate, could recognize that what was called climate science bore little relation to actual science, and that there was nothing to suggest the alarm being raised. Nobody was suggesting that there was no greenhouse effect or that climate doesn't change. That was always sort of ridiculous. They were simply noting the obvious, that there was nothing unusual in what we were seeing in the climate, including extreme events and anything else. We can all go through the statistics, are they increasing, are they decreasing? But in fact, even those statistics are dicey. It would be hard to establish anything unusual. The main basis for alarm has always been, can you prove it wouldn't occur, which is the philosophy of the precautionary principle. In any event, there's Bill Nye, I think, infamously looked forward to the death of the skeptics. And as we see from the dates of death for many of the people I mentioned, his wish was not without substance. The newcomers largely responding to the massive increases in funding are younger, and with the death of many of the previous generation, they have come to dominate the field, to, I should say, the great detriment of science itself. One of the things that becomes painfully obvious with the focus on CO2 is the retrograde progress in understanding major climate change. I noticed even earlier today in mentioning the things that one could look at and so on that would be important, I forget who was going through that, it struck me that one of the most important things was even left out of it. I mean, something called the Arctic inversion. Understanding that would help us understand some rather remarkable feature of climate that sort of been bugging me for a while. You know, if you ask what should the equator to pole temperature difference be, the usual approach in hydrodynamics is to ask what is transporting the heat. And it's, in this case, something called baroclinic instability, a kind of convective instability. And if you asked what would the temperature be if that were neutral, well, it ends up giving you an answer at the stratosphere levels, and says it'll be 20 degrees centigrade, which is what we had in the Eocene. And the whole difference between the Eocene and the glacial and the present is essentially the Arctic inversion. As best I know, hardly anyone is studying that. In any event, you have this age difference, you have the focus difference. You also have that, you know, those among the older generation who are still alive are the subject of constant public abuse and libel, leading several of them, like Bengtson, Leonard Bengtson, and Hank Tennikus, to withdraw from the field. Fred Singer went so far as to sue for libel. It was an interesting case that some of you may be familiar with. There was a man nominally working with Gore named Justin Lancaster who insisted that Roger Revelle was senile when he co-authored a paper with Singer that noted that there was insufficient evidence to warrant action. It's worth noting that Gore credits Revelle for introducing him to the CO2-related climate issue when Gore was a C- student in Revelle's course for non-scientists at Harvard. Revelle initiated Keeling's CO2 monitoring program, but I don't list him as a skeptic. I mean, he took a very interesting and nuanced view that the increasing CO2 was an experiment that he thought man was conducting, and he was interested in what would happen, but he certainly felt that our ignorance precluded actions that were not otherwise justified. And in a sense, he would have opposed actions because he wanted to see how the experiment worked out. At any rate, you know, when today one hears of overwhelming support for alarmism and for the control of carbon dioxide as the unique and precise solution to a largely unknown and uncertain set of phenomena, we should all realize the individuals promoting such narratives have variously never studied the underlying science, have decided to cash in on the windfall, are politically and economically motivated, fear expulsion from the ranks of political correct, and are intent on befuddling the public. In brief, we are in the midst of a very unhealthy situation for both this issue and science in general, a situation that demands, I fear, that we continue to battle against. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, standing round of applause for Dick Lindzen.